Oh, hey, that looks like a really cool racing jersey, and that also looks like a really cool shirt over there.
Yeah, they look kind of familiar.
So I looked this up, and it's part of Mondrian's work. These ideas didn't just come from anywhere. Instead, there was a man named Piet Mondrian, who was part of the Abstractionism Movement, who created all these things. We'll learn more about him later, but this is just an introduction to Abstractionism, an art movement characterized by logic and meaning throughout everything in their art pieces.
After a strictly Protestant upbringing in 1892, Mondrian entered the Academy for Fine Art in Amsterdam. He already was a qualified teacher, but he also practiced painting. Most of his work from this period is naturalistic or impressionistic, consisting largely of landscapes. These pastel images of his native country depict windmills, fields, and rivers, initially in a Dutch impressionist manner, and then in a variety of styles and techniques, documenting his research for personal style. These paintings are most definitely representational, in illustrating the influence various artistic movements had on Mondrian, including the vivid colors of Fauvism. The earliest paintings that show an inkling of the abstraction to come are a series of canvases from 1905 to 1908, which depict dim scenes of indistinct trees and houses with reflections in still water. Although the result leads the viewer to begin emphasizing the forms over the content, these paintings are still firmly rooted in nature. It is only the knowledge of Mondrian's later achievements that leads one to search for the roots of his future abstraction in these works. While in Paris, the influence of the Cubist style of Picasso and Georges Braque appeared almost immediately in Mondrian's work, includes paintings such as The Sea in 1912, and his various studies of trees from that year still contain a measure of representation. But increasingly they are dominated by geometric shapes and interlocking planes. While Mondrian was eager to absorb the Cubist influence into his work, it seems clear that he saw Cubism as a port of call on his artistic journey, rather than as a destination. Unlike the Cubists, Mondrian still attempted to reconcile his paintings with his spiritual pursuits, and in 1913 he began to fuse his art and his theosophical studies into a theory that signaled his final break from representational painting. In the early paintings of this abstract style, the lines are relatively thin. They are gray, not black. The lines also tend to fade as they approach the edge of the paintings, rather than stopping abruptly. The forms themselves, smaller and more numerous than in later paintings, are filled with primary colors, black or gray, and nearly all of them are colored, only a few are left white. In the 1921 paintings, many of the black lines, but not all of them, stop short at a seemingly arbitrary distance from the edge of the canvas. Although the divisions between the rectangular forms remain intact, here too, the rectangular forms remain mostly colored. As the years passed and Mondrian's work evolved further, he began extending all the lines to the edges of the canvases, and he also began to use fewer and fewer colored forms, favoring white instead. Mondrian produced lozenge composition with 4 yellow lines in 1933, a simple painting that introduced what for him was a shocking innovation: thick colored lines instead of black ones. After that one painting, this practice remained dormant in Mondrian's work until he arrived in Manhattan, at which he began to embrace it with abandon. In some examples of this new direction, such as Composition in 1938, Palace de la Concorde 1943, he appears to have unfinished black line paintings from Paris and completed them in New York by adding short perpendicular lines to different colors running between the longer black lines, or from a black line to the edge of the canvas. The newly colored areas are thick, almost bridging the gap between lines and forms, and it is startling to see color in a Mondrian painting that is unbounded by black. Other works mix along lines of red and mist, the familiar black lines creating a new sense of depth by the addition of a colored layer on top of the black one. His painting Composition Number 10 from 1939 to 1942, characterized by primary colors, white ground and black grid lines, are definitely Mondrian's radical but classical approach to the rectangle. The Great Tree. The initial reaction to the great tree might often be one of confusion. The brushstrokes and unusual color patterns are hard for the brain to sew together into a recognizable image. The only discernible aspect amidst all this chaos becomes the central congregation of dark lines into a large shape that forces the mind to semi-comprehend a trunk with branches. The reason for the confusing nature of the painting is because it works reverse to reality instead of recognizing the solid mass that it frames. It is recognizing the space that encompasses its surroundings. Every volume, streak, and profile that it surrounds the shape of this tree is recognized and given three-dimensional forms, alluding more to sets of fractures on a solid rather than tree. The specific nature of a tree is that of a light construction versus dense occupation. The construction of its trunk contrasted differently than the composition of its branches, become lighter, more airy as they reach away from the trunk. Force the recognition of volume of air that exits under and in between each of its members rather than the tree itself. The only quality that allows the tree to read as a solid mass is found in the lightest elements, the leaves. The leaves enclose and provide a barrier from the surrounding spaces, a quality which highlights the volumes formed within its construction and communicates differently within the tree's volume than outside of it. In the great tree, Pierre Mondrian captures the spatial presence of the tree by solidifying those volumes it holds within its members, and instead of using leaves, he uses darker shades, textures, and changes in color to provide the means to mask them. And this type of spatial recognition allows the viewer to freely assign depth to the volumes and read them in a variety of ways. Among the arguably dozens of ways that he treats the volumes within the tree can be easily recognized. Broadway Boogie Woogie. This canvas presents the viewer with the culmination in Mondrian's lifelong pursuit of conveying the order that underlies the natural world through purely abstract forms on a flat picture plane, broadening the use of his basic pictorial vocabulary of lines, squares, and primary colors. The black grid has been replaced by lines of color interspersed with blocks of solid color. This and his other late abstract paintings show a new, revitalized energy that was directly inspired by the vitality of New York City and the tempo of jazz music. The asymmetrical distribution of the brightly colored squares within the yellow lines echoed the varied pace of life in the bustling metropolis. One can almost see the people hurrying down the sidewalk as taxicabs hustle from stoplight to stoplight. Broadway Boogie Woogie not only alludes to life within the city, but also heralds New York City's developing role as the new center of modern art after World War II. Mondrian's last complete painting demonstrates his continued stylistic innovation while remaining true to his theories and format.
Kazimir Malevich, another artist of the Abstractionist era, based a lot of his work on Cubism, and he saw the attempt of these artists to break the form of reality in objects and trying to get down to its true meaning, rather than just saying, oh, this is a depiction of something, hey, this is something else. As influenced by the Italian Futurists, they looked for stylistic forms of modern sensations where they would simplify what they saw, but it was still different, to where it's not just the same as seeing it in nature, but it was still something else. Malevich tried to use Cubism by seeing the intuitive feeling discovered in objects, that the time in flattening it through its construction was more important than the essence and meaning of it, that the audience was often for just the artist and not for anyone else. Malevich saw that a picture is made, but the object is not transferred, showing how art is different than the way it used to be before. Malevich's Cubist influences can be seen in his work, Woman with Water Pails, Dynamic Arrangement. Malevich wanted to then make art that did not depict or attempt to reproduce reality. However, this didn't start until after he had some Impressionist influences, At first, Malevich based a lot of his work on Monet and Cézanne through nature and use of color. It wasn't just their use of color, but would be the Impressionist influences that might be in the city, and the types of people that he painted were also representative of the Impressionist era. After seeing what had happened through international art, Malevich had tried Impressionism, Fauvism, Cubism, and Futurism before creating his own style of art. Shown in Dynamic Suprematism number 57, Malevich had stated that the artist is no longer bound to the canvas, the pictorial surface, and can transfer his compositions from the canvas into space. Malevich is trying to say that pure art is different than just the art that came before, because now it's not depicting anything, it's just itself. Malevich described the black square as a cultural tabula rasa, or blank slate, to create a new aesthetic culture. Before black square, art was deformed and replicated nature. For Malevich, black square was a modern icon to replace traditional ones, even though he had gotten his inspiration for black square and another piece, white square, from glass window panes in Paris. Malevich's black square was looked at as art that worked against the materialism of his time. Malevich's art breaks away from the materialism of the World War I era by failing to depict anything the human mind could connect the ideas in his work to, since it is now part of his pure art. The black square also represents the loss of light with the new concept and control of time. The paint on black square was also not just one layer of black, but the black was applied in multiple layers, creating a cracked appearance and reinforcing the painterly character of the piece. However, this did not come without criticism. Black square, although considered the germ of all potential as it was shown at the 010 exhibition, it provoked an artistic scandal by moving from the original Cubo-Futurist works to suprematist compositions, with black square as the main piece in his new installation. Overall, Malevich believed that painters need to avoid objects and subjects, say no from reality if they wish to be pure painters, because instead they're just replicating what they already know, rather than branching out into the unknown. Instead of the art containing a link to something someone else already knows, the art is now its own form of realism, rather than just a representation of something else. However, Malevich uses the color red. He uses colors in many ways. Malevich uses the color red to symbolize revolution and political control, such as shown in Suprematism with 8 rectangles. He also uses black in his works to demonstrate the feeling of rhythm, that it is also seen as the opposite of Christianity, with evil, darkness, and demonic powers, as it seemed to absorb everything. Malevich was fascinated by the new technology of airplanes, and used colors, shapes, and placement to depict the idea of floating. He used all these ideas of shapes and colors to represent everything. Another piece by Malevich, painterly realism of a football player, color masses in the 4th dimension, represents the idea of how he uses geometry throughout all of his work. There aren't any shadows, yet the piece appears to be moving. The circle doesn't necessarily represent a ball, but it could. It's hard to tell. Malevich denies the image of an actual football player. It may just be derived from something else he knows in reality. When Malevich discusses painterly realism or painterly masses, he never explicitly describes this. He just says that flat forms are static, so they don't seem to move, whereas others that seem to recede are dynamic and move. This is how he gets the movement of geometric forms in his pieces. Kazimir Malevich is classified as an abstractionist because of the distinct way he uses shapes and colors. It is not all thrown together. Instead, even though it may not appear to have meaning to whoever is looking at it, it has meaning for Malevich himself. Each shape and each color and each placement of each shape and object and how big it is on the canvas, each has its own meaning to portray. Malevich's work shows the beauty of math and precision and logic throughout all of his art. These abstractionist artists did not live in isolation. Instead, they worked and influenced each other. One of the artists that influenced Malevich, and whom Malevich influenced, was Vasily Kandinsky. He almost became a professor of political economics, but he decided to become a painter because it was more aligned with his thinking. He was then able to explore ideas of color and light, photography, and sound. He saw how the Cubists played with the contiguous relationship between lines and forms, and saw not everything has to be precise and exact. He felt that art in itself had no purpose, but existed for itself. This caused him to venture into the zones of pure spirit. Kandinsky first based his ideas of abstract art from Monet, especially one from Monet's Haystack series. As you can see here, there appears to be a lack of clarity in the objects. At one point, Kandinsky, through his piece Non-Objective, 1916, he shows the use of Fauvist colors. By using Fauvist patching, it's part of reality. Kandinsky was the type of person who did not recognize one of his own paintings when he viewed it turned on its side, but since he liked it anyway, he realized that art must be kept separate from material objects, which is similar to Malevich and his idea of pure art. For example, Kandinsky's red oval references Malevich's pragmatism, with the large yellow quadrilateral also having its own meaning. The red has the same influences of communism that were also shown in Malevich's piece. Kandinsky shows a frequent extreme contrast between light and dark, such as in the piece Nymphenburg, Large Fountain. The extreme contrast between light and dark show the differences in emotion for him, and so where all the light is and where the dark is, and the separation, and what that may mean for him. That even as part of the audience, we may not know exactly what his intention was, but that's not necessarily the point. The point is that it has meaning, even if it's just meaning for him. It is all set up exactly in a way that makes sense to the artist, Kandinsky. Growing up through 3 wars in his lifetime, by the time World War II came around, sky blue represents Kandinsky's reaction to it. All the different animals and animal-like objects to show the emotion and the depression that were coming down for him, that he had a sense of hopelessness, but even though it doesn't necessarily make sense to us, it makes sense to him. One of the things that's often noticed in Kandinsky's work is his use of shapes and colors. For example, Kandinsky loves circles because he feels they have a strong sense of power in their variation. It has nothing to do with the specific geometric form of a circle, but by changing its size or its color, it can have different meanings for him, such as shown in the piece Several Circles. Also shown in this piece is how Kandinsky intentionally chooses which parts of the painting were matte and glossy, showing what parts he wants to bring out and make more dominant, and which parts he wants to make recessive and show in the background. No one knows for sure exactly why he wanted one part to look more dominant than the other, but again, that is important to Kandinsky. Kandinsky describes the colorful circles as the synthesis of the greatest opposition by pointing most clearly to the 4th dimension. Like Malevich, Kandinsky also wanted to introduce the dimension of time passing. Instead of just seeing what there is on the canvas, it is so much more. One of Kandinsky's pieces, Yellow, Red, Blue, has different collections of images. The way they are organized form 2 different centers, with the intertwining of red and blue to recreate the battle between St. George and the dragon. Kandinsky liked to use St. George, the patron saint of Moscow, in his works because he saw him everywhere. By seeing him everywhere, he had to have him in there somehow. Even if it's not the exact depiction, the idea still comes up. By having the 2 competing centers, Yellow, Red, Blue also demonstrates opposition and mediation, by having the left-hand side bright and open, with the right half dark, heavy, and dramatic, showing either some type of division or competition in between those 2 sides, potentially. By using simple geometric shapes, such as circles, triangles, and quadrilaterals, Kandinsky uses these as symbolic design rather than presenting direct forms of people, objects, etc. He didn't want to show something exactly like it was, but instead that what it symbolized was more important. So if you know what it's going to symbolize, you can portray it in a different manner. One of Kandinsky's most famous works is his piece Composition 7, which is 2 meters by 3 meters large. Some say it originated from his All Saints' Day painting and a representation of the Last Judgment. However, by the time it gets to its final part, it can't be seen anywhere. However, if you look hard enough, you can see from his earlier works a rowing boat in the bottom left, a rider in the right edge, and a troika at the top left. However, you can see it's very easy to tell that it takes a lack of material form. The piece takes on objective forms that they didn't originally take. The line is not used for an outline of a figure, but it's an element of itself, that instead Kandinsky sees a curved line, is a straight line brought out of course by constant sideward pressure. It's a greater tendency for wanting to close itself. In a way, lines are their own shapes and characters too. All the elements in Composition 7 seem to consume each other. It's hard to define the space. The roles of objects and figures have different color forms and a variety. They might be complex or simple, opaque or transparent, and flow into surroundings, or they might be firm. This one man, Munter, took different pictures of the preliminary studies for Composition 7. That he would see sketches of just certain parts, while others are basically paintings in their own right. From Munter's photographs documenting Kandinsky's progress on Composition 7, you can see that Kandinsky started from the oval form outlined in black in the center, and then went to the outside to paint the rest. For Composition 7, Kandinsky did almost 30 stages or phases or preliminary studies for this whole piece, so there might be different oil sketches, watercolors, and ink drawings. While Kandinsky claims that Composition 7 is non-objective, art historians see the motifs from his earlier pieces. But since the final copy is so abstracted, you can't really tell. In Composition 7, it's easier to see the main structure from the lines in the underdrawing than the multicolored forms in the final painting. Especially seen as in Composition 7, but in other pieces as well, Kandinsky believes that looking at colors has a psychic effect, where they emit a spiritual vibration. Although hard to believe as an outsider, Kandinsky tried to avoid making art just mere ornament. It needed meaning, and not too much stylization, even though it is hard to tell what a lot of his pieces mean. We know this because Kandinsky sees triangles as shapes that gradually move. They each have their own meaning to them. He says that each shape with its own form and color would express different qualities, and the combination of these shapes could collide or mesh with the shapes around it, such as a yellow triangle. By mixing a specific color with a specific shape, it takes on a totally new meaning. For example, circles represent perfection because they have no corners and they just seem all perfect and continuous. Yellow for him represents earthliness and solidity. It is hard to generalize Kandinsky's techniques, but he would use materials for his supports, such as plywood, stretched canvas, glass, and wood. In addition to seeing with the triangles and their points, he would see them as shapes that gradually move. Kandinsky is classified as an abstractionist, and not an abstract expressionist as many would think, because his art has a certain organization to it, with logical placement of every piece, and not just logical placement, but of the exact color and lines, and every single detail of it has a specific meaning to Kandinsky. As discussed from before, Malevich would compare his work to Kandinsky's, but the main difference is that Malevich wouldn't see art and life in a series of colored lines. It needs non-objectiveness and interpretation by the audience. Instead, Kandinsky has his own self-rules, and interpretation by the audience is not important. Instead, it's just interpretation by himself is all that matters. Such is shown in First Abstract Watercolor. Kandinsky's use of watercolor on paint doesn't connect to any objects.
Another important artist of Abstractionism was Georgia O'Keeffe, who studied imitative realism at the University of Chicago. In 1908, she got an award for her painting Dead Rabbit with Copper Pot, and it was a realistic painting. But after getting this award, she stopped painting for a while because she felt that she couldn't be unique in this category. She was inspired again at a summer course for artists where she met Alan Bemond and Arthur Wesley Dow at Columbia University. Dow and Kandinsky, two people that really influenced her, evolutionized her ways by making art an expression of the soul and spirit of the painter and not the subject being painted. As stated on the book of O'Keeffe Museum, Dow believed that the goal of art was the expression of the artist's personal ideas and feelings, and that such subject matter was best realized through harmonious arrangements of line, color, and notan, which is a Japanese system of lights and darks. Dow's ideas offered O'Keeffe an alternative to imitative realism. Dow also taught her to show emotion, energy, and movement in her works. He said that specific placement of the lines, shapes, colors, and value would show the piece's true meaning. O'Keeffe once said when interviewed, "I had been taught to work like others, and after careful thinking, I decided that I wasn't going to spend my life doing what had already been done. I decided to start anew, to strip away what I had been taught, to accept as true my own thinking. O'Keeffe learned about Asian art and was very influenced by it. It was based on light and darkness, dividing the pictorial field on the surface and infinite space. She began to make charcoal drawings, then started to send them to a colleague, who also showed them to Alfred Stieglitz. Alfred Stieglitz was a well-known photographer of the time. Stieglitz always worked to promote her work. He put many of her exhibits together. In the 1920s, she had mostly been experimenting, but by the 1930s, she developed her own unique style. Skunk Cabbage shows O'Keeffe's transition into a modernist style by taking the advice of Dow and Kandinsky, who taught her about modernist aesthetics and theories. Marion M. Goethel said, "In balancing concerns for natural fact and formal composition, she endows her designs with a power beyond the ordinary and demonstrates the blending of abstract and representational vision that characterized her finest work." Her painting Skunk Cabbage or Koskab shows a combination of abstract and representational modes of expression. She took an object, in this case two, and painted it in a perspective that we can't tell what it is. By focusing on a single leaf, she still stays focused on her botanical subject. The shape of the leaf was taken by close observation, but its writhing gives it a more expressive purpose. Skunk Cabbage takes place in spring, which in art has always meant rebirth, hope, and life, and suggests continuity. But this spring isn't the typical spring. Instead, it is a painting of a plant bursting forth from the unknown, inexorably drawn up, not by sunlight, but by unidentifiable forces around it. The plant is vital, but its ultimate destiny is beyond its own control, and therefore shadowed. O'Keeffe was part of the Stieglitz group, a group of artists that created non-representational art. Some was based on nature. She shows the influence of this group in Skunk Cabbage. Skunk Cabbage represents ideas of the unconscious. In her times, people's unconsciousness were expanding and growing, just like the plant. Goethel once said, "Plants will grow in spring regardless, but it is not certain whether the plant will enter a nurturing or destroying world." He also said, "While the forms and colors are organic, the skunk cabbage is not planted in its wet, swampy, fertile habitat." She set the mood of the painting Skunk Cabbage by putting it in a smoky, dark, unknown place. It has warm colors and strong vertical tensions. The strong yellow makes it look like fire or hell, with the red, browns, and grays blended in to make a strong and active element in the painting. Goethel said, "O'Keeffe's a typical strengthening of the background in Skunk Cabbage in the sense that much is happening outside the canvas boundaries to support the smoky, slightly sinister atmosphere as an intended quality available to her in abstract painting." The painting has an element of force and moving upwards by having the vertical pull focused on the plant and the background giving a sense of growth and mysteriousness. Having no roots to feed them and keep them in place makes us feel that the plant is floating and not in its natural environment. O'Keeffe purposely took the cabbage out of the botanical world to make it look more mysterious. Goethel said, "The colors of the leaves, dark purples, reds, and fresh greens, are definitely inspired by the plant itself, but are greatly simplified. The leaves look like ones of a cabbage, but don't look very natural." By making the plant moving upward and across the sheet, shows vitalist themes which were popular in the Stieglitz circle. Skunk Cabbage was not a single painting, but a series. The series went from naturalistic to more abstract. The details became more simpler. They drastically change as she goes through the series. The pieces start very natural and end up abstract. She keeps dropping details as she goes in order to make a more bolder and simplified design that focus on a single leaf. According to Gothal's, Skunkavich series is a celebration of nature's timeless vitality. One of the pieces of the series, the most close-up one, is symmetrical in leafy shapes. It's more of a piece created by imagination rather than observation, but the colors and shapes are inspired by observing. Georgia O'Keeffe knew how to use both geometric and organic polarities very well and balanced. According to her painting, she'd use very bright colors or very dark ones with very bizarre contrast. The colors vary according to where she is while she's painting. By placing objects in unknown environments, such as in Skunkavich and many other works, it makes us wonder. The series of Skunkavich close-ups opened up doors to continue using this style, but instead of using cabbages, she used flowers, which are the pieces she is most recognized for. She enjoyed painting organic things, for example flowers, to try and understand the world better. She also said that people needed to pay more attention and look more closely. She thought that if she painted very close details, the people would notice it. Organic metaphors in her works were of symbols of social unrest and vital growth. The Stieglitz group was inspired by the cycles of nature and the rhythm of life. Arthur Dove was part of the Stieglitz group. His piece, Tree Trunks, shows vitality or continuity of life by having amoebic shapes under the ground. On the other hand, O'Keeffe's Crazy Day is similar to Dove's Tree Trunks by having organic processes or vegetal growth, also shown in her Skunkavich piece. Another example that shows nature in very abstract forms is drawing 8. It's allowed to be interpreted differently according to one's personal experiences. There's 3 different sections. The right means full of river or rise of flame. The middle is the hillside or trees, and the left, which is a jagged black line, signifies rocky mountains or lightning. Now if we compare drawing 8 to Van Gogh's cypresses, they both show movement and growth. Van Gogh's is very crazy, while O'Keeffe's was the very opposite of that. By comparing these 2 pieces, we can see how O'Keeffe was able to make an idea her own. For example, it has buds, stems, and leaves, which shows the relationship to the botanical world. It has patterns of zigzag lines and shapes, and it gives a sense of a 3D world to make it look as if the piece is coming toward you. O'Keeffe is mostly known for her flower paintings. What makes them unique is that she would zoom in so much to the point where we can't even tell that it's a flower anymore. She liked painting a lot of calla lilies because, according to her, they are sculptural flowers, meaning that they have hard, clean shapes that allowed her to close in and simplify the view. Novak once said, "The flowers, writ large, gain extraordinary monumentality, at the same time that the biological rhythms they embody gain power and vitality." Some people think that the flowers look like women's genitalia, and some think that the hidden meaning of her pieces is the praising of the body in a holy and sacred way. That is because at her time, she was one of the few famous woman artists. O'Keeffe didn't enjoy being called a woman artist, she just wanted to be called an artist. But because she was a woman, many do think that her flower paintings have a feminine power and represent fertility. Georgia O'Keeffe was also famous for paintings of New Mexico landscapes that have weird configurations and architectural forms, as well as some paintings that are of bones that she'd find in New Mexico. O'Keeffe always worked in series. They each explored a single object or subject. This is because she liked exploring the possibilities. For example, she would explore with how the color, shapes, and lines affect the piece. By altering a piece, she'd become more liberated and could express herself better. It allowed her to find deeper views of the subject being painted. It helped her bring up new problems or other uncommon solutions, but most importantly, it helped her evaluate her own work. O'Keeffe once said, Series fascinated me so that I forgot what they were, except that they were shapes together. Singing shapes. Series were also a modernist norm inspired by Cézanne's series of fruit-laden tables and Monet's series of poppies and poplars, grain stacks, and water lilies. One of her most dramatic series was The Sky Above Clouds. They were inspired by traveling on airplanes. Each of them had two sections, clouds that were the ground and the atmosphere above the cloud. However, as the series continued, each one would get altered a little bit more, and as the series ended, it became more abstract. Sky Above the Clouds 1 has a pattern of clouds on the ground that lead our eyes into space. Scott once said, "We see a fake horizon. Horizons represent an orienting device for us, an aspiration, the shifting boundary between the visible present and the occluded future." He also said, "The vista beyond the horizon will be identical to that scene, and the image dissolves into abstraction both spatially and conceptually." The decreasing of size of the clouds as it goes back is expressing distance in ancient art. The first Sky Above Clouds was very minimalist, but as the series continues, it gets more detailed. In Sky Above the Clouds 4, she made it a panoramic canvas. What was so different and surprising is that the clouds are shaped like cobbled stone, a very odd shape. It has a very dramatic impact because it makes us feel like we walked out of the side of the airplane. The modernist repetition lets us step back to see our horizon. O'Keeffe used shrinking rather than perspective to make us feel like we're looking at it from an angle. Rose said, "A double image is depicted. There is a horizon, but its unexpected placement above the clouds suggests that the blue sky is also a blue sea flowing away toward a distant horizon. The clouds seem to have a rhythmic movement fading off as to make it seem like a rocking sea." Stieglitz was inspired by O'Keeffe after this painting, and he started photographing the sky a lot. Because of them too, the sky became a modernist subject. What makes her fit into the abstract group is that through her paintings, she never tells us what it is. She makes us think about it and doesn't make it look very obvious. She depended a lot on simplifying the shape and detail of the object that she was painting. She once said that some of her abstract pieces were shapes that she saw in her mind very clearly, so that should tell us that she was very abstract. She didn't even look at that, she just made it up in her mind. She also fits into the Abstractionism group because she distorted the size-scale relationships and used total manipulation as descriptive controls. And that was one of Kandinsky's theories. She also believed that the purpose of art was to make art more living and more vital. And O'Keeffe once said, "Maybe through psychology, psychoanalysis, self-knowledge, the ideas of aesthetics may change." She revolutionized art by going off on her own and not following a certain style. Instead, she combined Asian painting, Kandinsky's theories, and her own knowledge of photography to make her own style. O'Keeffe anticipated much of what characterizes abstractionist expressionism. Its radically compressed, telescoped space, holistic or single-image compositions with immediate graphic impact, and intense, high-key saturated color, suppression of detail, and a reductive literalism that questions depiction as an outward convention of representation.
So now that we've taken a look at these different artists, such as Mondrian, Kandinsky, Malevich, and O'Keeffe, we can see that the characteristics of abstractionism are logic and having a meaning for everything. Sometimes it may not make sense to the person looking at it directly, but instead it is meant for the artist, him or herself, not necessarily for others' entertainment. So remember, when trying to characterize an art piece as abstractionist, look for logic and meaning within the pieces. Some of them, like Mondrian and Malevich, may be more obvious with straighter lines and colors that are very distinct. But others, like Kandinsky, that even though it may seem like a mess at first, and you might not be able to understand it, you just have to realize that he had these meanings for himself with the colors and the shapes. The biggest thing is that everything has meaning and a purpose when it comes to abstractionism.